You know what's better than seeing superheroes in action? Teases of superheroes in action. Oh yeah, nothing's better than introducing a comic character only for them to not suit up quite yet.
Next time, baby.
Actually, that's agonizing. It kind of hurts the soul a little bit. But hey, maybe the payoff is going to be worth it, right? Today, I'm talking about some of the biggest characters we've seen in the MCU that haven't suited up yet, but could possibly down the line. Red Hulk, Agent Venom, the Black Knight, I'm talking about all of them. So what are we waiting for? I don't want to tease you like the MCU has been doing with these characters, so let's get into it right now.
Suit up.
Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross is surprisingly one of the characters that has been around the longest, even though he's never been given the full spotlight. He was one of the major antagonists in The Incredible Hulk back in 2008, and then after that catastrophe, failed upwards and became the Secretary of State, where he was basically the face of the government bureaucracy that wanted to pass the Sokovia Accords. He then chased after Natasha for a bit, but overall wasn't very successful, and then wanted to arrest Captain America when Nomad Cap popped back up in Infinity War, which also wasn't successful. But hey, after all that failure, he did manage to snag a spot at Tony's funeral, so he has that going for him at least. History tells us that Ross will probably try another horrible idea any day now, and given his track record, I'm so surprised he hasn't taken the steps to turn into his comic book alter ego yet, Red Hulk. Red Hulk is a lot like our Hulk, only he's more intelligent and aware of his surroundings, plus has a tendency to emit a lot of red-hot heat instead of gamma radiation. And given that it's been over a decade since the character's debut in the MCU, is there still a chance we could see Red Hulk? I think it's a toss-up. The biggest thing working against it is actually the actor who plays Red Hulk. William Hurt is no spring chicken. He's in his 70s now, and sure, there's computer magic nowadays where if there is a transformation, William Hurt could just voice him, but who knows? Other than that, story-wise, I could see a scenario where this plays out. The MCU has been teasing the Thunderbolts recently with people like Baron Zemo and Abomination. And although not every incarnation of that special ops team is led by Thunderbolt Ross, there's no way the MCU would pass up a chance to have the character named Thunderbolt Ross be responsible for the Thunderbolts. And picture this scenario. Imagine a Thunderbolts movie that sees Thunderbolt Ross leading a team that consists of Zemo, Abomination, Wong, maybe throw Hawkeye in there just because, etc. Then sometime in the movie, Thunderbolt Ross is exposed to something and becomes Red Hulk, both now leading the team and being a part of it. The only problem with this is I don't see a situation where both Abomination and Red Hulk are on the same team. Who would need two brawlers like that? And thanks to Shang-Chi, it definitely looks like Abomination has bigger plans in the MCU, so I just don't know. Is there a way to make Red Hulk work? Everyone knows that Eddie Brock is Venom, but a character that has only gotten more and more popular over time is Agent Venom, which is the comic storyline that sees Flash Thompson fuse with the Venom symbiote and become his own mercenary-esque soldier. And honestly, because of the complicated relationship between Sony and Disney, I think Agent Venom might actually be the best bet for the MCU. And that brings us to this version of Flash Thompson. If you compare the MCU's Flash to someone like Sam Raimi's Flash, you'll notice some stark differences. For one, Raimi's Flash looks 35 years old and built like a tank and would eventually go on to play Deathstroke. The MCU's Flash Thompson, well, he's specifically not that. He's more of a rich kid bully who is annoying rather than flat out mean. It's hard to think this Flash could become an elite soldier, but maybe that's actually where the storyline comes into play. We know this Flash has a troubled family history full of neglect, and maybe the events of No Way Home, where he now realizes the kid he bullied throughout high school is actually his biggest hero, causes him to reevaluate his life and want to do something good with it. From there, the logical step is the army, and then it's just a matter of time before he crosses paths with the symbiote. It would be fun to see the changes this Flash goes through if he did become Agent Venom, and it would help solve any issues with certain rights. We know Venom Let There Be Carnage teased a collision between Tom Holland's Spidey and Tom Hardy's Venom, but if it becomes too much of a jumbled mess, maybe things will end with Venom back in the Sonyverse, with a piece of him left behind to eventually bond with Flash. That way you could have the Venom symbiote fully in the MCU with Flash Thompson, while also keeping Tom Hardy's version off doing his own thing. Everyone wins. I want to stick with Spider-Man characters for a second and talk about the MCU's Ned Leeds. It's pretty interesting that the MCU decided to make Peter Parker's best friend in high school Ned Leeds and not another character. Sure, Harry Osborn would have been a bit strange and too wrapped up in the lore, but it's not like historically Peter Parker and Ned Leeds were friends in high school. It seemed like they were adapting the Ganke Lee character from the Ultimate Comics, but rather just gave him the Ned Leeds name. Though what's interesting about that is how in the comics, Ned Leeds eventually became one of the versions of the Hobgoblin, one of Spidey's archenemies. Could the MCU have named this character Ned Leeds with the intention of turning him into some sort of villain down the line? I think there's two ways this is possible. The first one is the more traditional route. If the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies really do continue for a brand new trilogy after No Way Home, maybe it gets to the point where Ned starts to want to do more. He already talked about in Homecoming how he would let the spider bite him to give himself powers. Maybe an opportunity arises where he can get his own superpowers from somewhere like Oscorp and things go horribly wrong, causing it to warp his mind and lead him down a path of darkness. Or if you wanted a different scenario, maybe Spider-Man encounters a Hobgoblin Ned Leeds in the multiverse, and he'd be forced to battle a different version of his friend and grapple with those implications. Either way, I think it works. Okay, this one we know for a fact is coming. In the comics, Jane Foster eventually becomes her own version of Thor called Mighty Thor, after being able to lift Mjolnir. When Thor Love and Thunder was announced, one of the big things about it was how Natalie Portman was returning to the franchise to become the Mighty Thor. This was a big shock because after Portman's less than pleasant experience working on Thor the Dark World, and the Thor character was soft rebooted in Ragnarok, it felt like Jane's story was done. But that's not the case anymore, as Mighty Thor will make her grand reappearance soon. How do you guys think this will work? How will Thor and Jane's dynamic change now that she might be more powerful than him? Is this our Jane or a Jane from a different universe? So many questions. While the Eternals movie had one tough task of giving all its main Eternals enough introduction and screen time, it didn't even stop there. It also took time to tease Dane Whitman, who in the comics would go on to become the Black Knight. Now, although I like Kit Harington and thought it was a fun role, I will admit his introduction and backstory felt a little shoehorned into an already jam-packed movie. It had moments where Cersei dropped exposition about Dane's tough relationship with his uncle, and ended with Dane telling Cersei that his family history is a lot more complicated than he thought. And if that wasn't enough a tease, the post-credit scene is devoted to Dane reaching for the ebony blade before a mysterious voice, that was later revealed to be Mahershala Ali's vampire hunter Blade, interrupts him. That's a lot of teasing, and it's why, although it's not officially confirmed where Dane will pop up again, that the MCU has big plans for the character, so expect the suit up soon. Miles Morales does exist in the MCU. Donald Glover's Aaron Davis mentioned his nephew in Spider-Man Homecoming, and any big fan immediately knew he was talking about the ultimate version of Spider-Man, Miles Morales. And if they mentioned Miles, that means it's only a matter of time before we see him and he starts his own Spidey journey. But who knows when that'll happen? I had a theory that by the end of No Way Home, Peter Parker's Spider-Man would switch over to the Sonyverse and leave Miles Morales the opportunity to step up and be the webhead in the MCU, but I doubt that's the case anymore. With half confirmations that Tom Holland will continue in the MCU, we just have to hope that we eventually get to a point where Peter mentors a young Miles. Though with Peter still being a young teenager himself, that might take some time. Alas, poor Scorpion, I don't know what's going to happen with you. Mac Gargan was introduced in Spider-Man Homecoming, and the post-credit scene teased a team-up with the Vulture. This would seem like it was eventually setting up Gargan to don his signature Scorpion costume and cause trouble for Spider-Man. But now maybe that's not the case. The MCU has changed a lot since Homecoming. Now everything is about the multiverse, and everyone's just focused on Tom Holland teaming up with past Spider-Man in order to fight versions of different franchise villains like Doc Ock and Green Goblin. That kind of makes Scorpion less exciting, right? And with Michael Keaton's Adrian Toomes seemingly busy jumping between the Sonyverse and the MCU with his appearance in Morbius, it feels like the Scorpion tease will remain a tease for quite some time. Okay, this one might be a bit of a cheat since we have definitely seen Pepper Potts suit up, but I just don't think it was under the right circumstances. She wore Iron Man armor in Iron Man 3, but that was mostly to get her out of a tough situation, and then we saw her fight side by side with Tony in Endgame wearing her signature rescue armor. Yes, this was cool and all, but it felt a little strange to have no lead up to this. Like, in the 5 years since Infinity War, did Tony and Pepper normally wear their suits and train together? Did Pepper go out on her own to be a hero? Was the the Endgame battle the first official time she suited up, I just want to know the backstory, which is why I included Pepper on this list. Yes, we've seen her suit up, but haven't seen the full story behind it, and I think that's important. In the comics, there's a prominent storyline where Shuri takes over the Black Panther mantle from T'Challa and becomes her own version of the character. We didn't get to see Shuri suit up that much in the original Black Panther movie besides some cool Panther bracelets, and she was mostly regulated to the woman in the chair role, assisting T'Challa with tech and new upgrades. But due to the tragic passing of Chadwick Boseman, all reports point to Shuri suiting up and taking over the lead Black Panther role in the upcoming sequel. Seeing her in the armor will both be exciting, as Shuri is definitely one of the most gifted characters in the entire MCU, but also a little bittersweet given the situation. Spider-Man Homecoming reintroduced a lot of familiar Spider-Man characters as high schoolers. Besides Ned Leeds and Flash Thompson, you also had Betty Brant, a version of Liz Allen who turned out to be Liz Toombs, a new version of Mary Jane Watson, and also a lesser-known character named Cindy Moon. Now, to some, this may seem like a random character, but comic fans know Cindy has a much greater destiny in store. In the comics, Cindy was actually bit by the same spider that bit Peter, and manifested her own Spidey powers. Though, unlike Peter, Cindy was locked away for years in a secret bunker and only emerged much later ready to fight crime as the hero Silk. It's a backstory that I don't think the MCU can adapt now, but the fact that Cindy Moon is in the MCU means anything is possible in terms of Silk's future. Ant-Man and the Wasp was a fun movie on its own, but had the unfortunate issue of releasing after Infinity War and before Endgame. So even though it tried to set up future plot lines, everything was shifted to the side by the end. Like, remember how Scott was in the quantum realm at the end of the movie because he was specifically gathering materials to help Ghost from perishing? You kind of gotta hope that Ghost was one of the ones snapped away for 5 years, or else she definitely didn't survive until Endgame. But the movie ended with Dr. Bill Foster declaring that he wouldn't abandon Ghost and ran away with her, leaving his story open-ended. In the comics, Bill Foster suits up as the superhero Goliath, a character who grows in size. Foster in the MCU talked about how he experimented with size back in the day, but it's something we never got to see. But with how crazy Quantum Mania sounds, maybe we'll see a clip of Goliath suiting up. So this one only technically counts a little bit. The Incredible Hulk teased the appearance of the Leader, but we haven't seen that resolution, at least in live action. There was a comic that revealed that right after Samuel Stearns was infected with Hulk blood, his intelligence suddenly went through the roof. But Black Widow actually showed up and captured him. But that's a comic, so I count that as not fully seeing him suit up. I just want to see his big green head in the MCU. Is that too much to ask? I don't think it is. And you would think that the MCU has moved on from the Incredible Hulk villains, but with Abomination returning at least twice in Phase 4, why couldn't the Leader pop up again? What I love about comics is that whenever a character ages out of a role or takes up a different name, there's usually someone else that can take over the old mantle. When we first met Sam Wilson, he was the Falcon and worked loyally as Captain America's partner. But then Endgame happened and Sam found himself presented with the opportunity to be the new Captain America. Although it took a whole Disney Plus show for the circumstances to work, Sam is indeed the new Captain America in the MCU. But where does that leave the Falcon moniker? Well, it doesn't look like it will be empty for long. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier show introduced Joaquin Torres, a young soldier who bonded with Sam and helped out when necessary. In the comics, Torres does become the Falcon after Sam, and it does sort of seem like the show was teasing this development as well. I mean, after Sam gets his new fancy vibranium Captain America suit, he tells Torres he can keep the broken wings. If that's not a tease for Torres to fix them up and wear them himself, I don't know what is. How cool would it be to see Sam mentor a new Falcon? That sounds awesome. We've been introduced to a lot of potential young Avengers in the MCU in Phase 4, and one of the most exciting is Eli Bradley, the grandson of Isaiah Bradley, who we met in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier show. Eli has a complicated history in the comics, first lying about how he had the super soldier serum in him before eventually getting it through a blood transfusion with his grandfather. It feels like all these young Avengers teases are just too much of a coincidence at this point for the MCU to not follow through, and I really hope that means Eli Bradley's Patriot has a big role coming up in the future. Avengers Endgame changed so much in the MCU, but one of the more subtle changes is the aging up of Scott Lang's daughter, Cassie Lang. In the comics, Cassie Lang becomes Stature, a hero just like her father who can manipulate her size and also becomes part of the Young Avengers. In the Ant-Man movies, the young Cassie was enthusiastic about becoming a superhero like her dad, but it was clear she was way too young to fully suit up yet. But now that 5 years have passed since Endgame, and presumably maybe 1 or 2 more will go by in the timeline before Ant-Man Quantumania takes place, it means Cassie is now an age-appropriate teen superhero who can join her father on the battlefield. And given that Cassie was recast in Ant-Man Quantumania, chances are the MCU has a bigger role for her to play down the line. Get ready for Stature. Look, I know we already have a bunch of big-budget movies on the calendar, and now no less than 5 MCU Disney Plus shows on a yearly basis, but I hope we see these characters suit up at some point. Some are easier to work in than others, but for those that are difficult, I don't know, just give them a Disney Plus show. Everyone's getting one nowadays, right? It would work.